Hello, I'm Tyler Dowling, and this is my presentation on Chapter 12 of Educational Psychology by John W. Sandrock. This chapter is on planning, instruction, and technology. This chapter will be going over the information that we've already learned, the cognitive processes, and we'll be discussing how to implement these into lesson plan and instructional planning. We will be exploring teacher-centered and learner-centered lessons, and we'll be building that off of the previous knowledge that we have on behavioral and social cognitive approaches. And we will end this by discussing how to implement technology as a classroom application. Okay, to start out this lesson, I'm going to have you all answer a question sent to you in a form. The first question is just a general question on what you guys know about lesson plans and just any previous knowledge that you might have picked up through your schooling or through your observations at Ferris. Keep in mind that this is a pretty broad question and not looking for really specifics, just really what you know about lesson plans. Okay, so our first real slide is on instructional planning. So it starts out the chapter, Sandrock really emphasizes the importance of planning as a teacher. He goes as far to saying that planning is a critical aspect of being a competent teacher. It also discusses quite heavily at the beginning instructional planning, which through the use of instructional planning, a teacher can develop an organized strategy of how to go about teaching each of their lessons. It helps to have a planned out idea of what you're going to be teaching so that you can make sure that you are hitting all the aspects that you want in order to make sure that each of your students has like their best situation to learn. One of the parts that Sandrock brings up is that planning is, in some school districts, considered mandatory, or is mandatory. He talks about how they might require like a week's work in advance, and this is pretty basic from the schools that I've heard about. It's used so that if like a sub is needed, or so that they know what is going on for especially like department heads to keep track of classes. Okay, so our next slide is titled Strategies for Instructional Learning. Sandrock lays out in the text 4 main strategies or elements that instructional planning can be organized around. The first is the nature of the subject. So what is it, and like what is the best way to implement what you are learning in a classroom environment. The next one is the learners. What are your students like? What is their best way of learning? Are they more of a hands-on group, or are they more of a listening sort of a learner? And finding the best activities that can suit them. The third is context. The context of the information. So how can you make the information that you are teaching and the subject that you are teaching really relate to them? How can you have them as students understand what you are teaching and the reason for you teaching? And the final one is the teacher's role, which is basically what you as a teacher are meant to be doing. Are you going to be leading a classroom discussion? Are you going to be explaining them in a presentation, or are you simply going to just be making sure that they stay on task while they do some classwork? Okay, so the next slide is titled Mapping Backwards. It discusses a strategy that is talked about in the book called Mapping Backwards, in which you start by deciding what your goal for your students in your classes by the end of like your lesson, and you start out by deciding the goal, then developing activities to help your students reach these goals, finding like what elements of scaffolding can really help your students' progress, and It also, on this slide, discusses that a very good way of doing instructional planning is to decide what you want your students to reach, what goals you want them to reach by the end of a certain time period, which we will be diving into in the next upcoming slides, and just figuring out where you want them to be so you have a better understanding of at what level they need to be at what point in the class. Okay, so our next slide is time frames and planning. Time frames are an important aspect of planning. It helps you decide what goals you want your students to reach at certain time periods during the year. In the next slide, it shows the 5 frames of, or 5 time spans of teaching planning. And these are basically meant to give you a better idea of where your students need to be so that you can gauge their progress and make sure that they are staying up to date in regards to your planning for your entire year for your lessons. So our next slide is a diagram. It kind of lays out the characteristics of each time span for teachers' planning, and it just lays out some of the characteristics of the goals that you should be setting for these time plans and how you would be gauging when they have met these goals. So for like a yearly planning, some of like the ways that you would gauge them might be more based in tests, where on the daily planning you might just be more gauging it on how active they were in classwork and in discussions. So our next slide is a pretty short one. It's entitled Spontaneous Instruction. Basically just a reminder that some of the more memorable moments of instruction in a classroom might be pretty spontaneous, and you can't really plan for them. It is very important, and Sandrock just explains that it is very important to make sure that you are well planned out as a teacher, but he does acknowledge that spontaneous instruction does have its merits. And just also I add in some information that you can aid your ability to create some moments of spontaneous instruction in a classroom by looking over the material on the lead up to performing a lesson in order to sort of give yourself a refresher so that you might be able to answer any questions from your students in order to possibly give one of your students a real breakthrough on the information and get them more interested in the topic. So the next slide is another one of the questions that you are supposed to be answering on the forms that I sent out. Is just a simple one. Which of the 4 elements of instructional learning do you feel are the most important and why? So the 4 elements again are the nature of the subject, the learners, the context, and the teacher's role. So basically, which one do you feel like you would emphasize more when creating a lesson plan? So the next slide is titled Teacher-Centered Lesson Planning. Teacher-centered lesson planning is a way of making a lesson where it's more characterized by direct instruction, more instructional strategies for the teacher, and it's just more based around the teacher informing the students on the material, and more based on them providing the material to the students than the students more finding it themselves. 3 of the tools that are useful to implement when using a teacher-centered lesson planning are behavioral objectives, task analysis, and instructional classifications. These will be discussed in the next few slides. So our next slide is behavioral objectives. Behavioral objectives are statements of changes that a student wishes to see in their student's performance. 3 parts of behavioral objectives are student's behavior, focuses on what a student will learn or do. So, what behavior do you want them to learn? The next one is conditions where the behavior will occur. So a state of how the behavior will be evaluated or tested. And the final one is performance criteria, which is basically just a determining factor of what level of performance will be accepted of the students by the teacher. So the next slide is task analysis. Task analysis focuses on the breakdown of a task that you want your students to accomplish, like behavioral objectives. Task analysis has 3 steps to implement. The first step is determining what the student must learn. The second is a list of materials that are required to learn the given materials. For that step, you're letting them know what materials are needed. So if they need a pen and piece of paper, then you let them know, hey, you're going to need a pen and a piece of paper for this project. And the third one is a list the components meant to learn the material. For this is just a list of tasks that they need to accomplish in order to perform whatever project or learning of the material that needs to be done. Okay, so the next slide is instructional taxonomies. Instructional taxonomies are a classification system that put educational objectives into 3 domains in order to create goals and objectives for a student's lesson plan. There are 3 domains. The first one is the cognitive domain. These 3 domains were developed in Bloom's taxonomy and were developed by Benjamin Bloom and his colleagues in 1956. There are 6 objectives to the cognitive domain. The first one is knowledge. Students have the ability to remember information. For example, an objective might be to list or describe 4 main advantages of using a computer for word processing. The next objective is comprehension. Students understanding the information, being able to explain it in their own words. The third objective is application. Students, using their own knowledge to solve real-life problems. For example, an objective might be to apply what they have learned about using a computer for word processing to how this could be used in various careers. The fourth one is analysis. A student being able to break down complex information into smaller parts and relate information to other information. The fifth is synthesis. Student combine elements and create new information, so figuring out 2 different things have a relationship and being able to understand that relationship. And then the final one is evaluation. Student make good judgments and decisions, just overall understanding material and being able to judge it and understand it. The next domain is the affective domain. The first objective of the affective domain is receiving. Students become aware of or attend to something in the environment. An example of this is a guest comes to class to talk with students about reading. An objective might be for students to listen carefully to the speaker. The next objective is responding. Students become motivated to learn and display a new behavior as a result of an experience. The third is valuing. Students become involved in or committed to some experience. The next objective is organizing. Students integrate a new value into an already existing set of values and give it a proper priority. And the final one is value characterizing. Students act in accordance with the value and are firmly committed to it. And then the final domain is psychomotor domain. The first objective of this domain is reflex movements. The next one is basic fundamentals. Students make basic voluntary movements. The next one is perceptual abilities. Students can use their senses, such as seeing, hearing, touching. The next one is physical abilities. Students develop general skills of endurance, strength, flexibility, and agility. The next one is skilled movements. And the final one is non-discursive behaviors. Students communicate feelings and emotions through bodily actions. The final domain's a little bit, for maybe a younger group, but everything can be used by education. So the next slide is direct instruction. Direct instruction is a teacher-centered approach characterized by direction and control from the teacher. The main goal of direct instruction is maximizing the learning time of the students. A lot of the characteristics of this approach are limiting the use of outside materials like cell phones, toys, games, and more maximizing, instruction, schoolwork, and more like normal classroom work, if that makes sense. So the next slide, titled Teacher-Centered Learning Strategies. Santrock describes 6 strategies in the textbook of teacher-oriented instruction. The next few slides will go over them. The first one is orienting. The second one is lecturing, explaining, and demonstration. The third is questioning and discussing. The fourth is mastery learning. The fifth is seat work, and the final and sixth one is homework. All right, the first of these teacher-centered learning strategies is orienting. Orienting is based around the beginning of class and getting the students oriented in a way that they are ready to understand and discuss the material that you are going to be teaching them in that day's lesson. The first type of orienting is advanced organizers. This would be, like handing out a sheet that quickly goes over an idea of what all you are going to be teaching them today. The next one is expository. It's basically just providing the class with knowledge that is new to them and relates to the upcoming material in that day's lesson plan, and that helps them orient their way of thinking so that they have some sort of information going into it so that they just are getting everything thrown at them. And the final one is comparative organizer. This one is just introducing new material to the class that connects with material that they have already learned so that they can understand the new material that you're going over that day by comparing it to information that they might have already learned. Right, the next slide is on the second strategy for teacher-centered learning. It is lecturing, explaining, and demonstration. Santrock lays out some of the important strategies to implement when lecturing. The first one is presenting information and motivating a student's interest in the subject. So, maybe starting out with a really cool thing about the topic, getting kids like, wow, this is cool. So you heighten their interest so that they're more focused for the rest of the class. The second one is introducing a topic before the student reads or giving instruction on a task. Therefore, they might have a better understanding of the material before they go into reading it from the textbook because you've given some sort of explanation on the material. The third is summarizing information after a discussion. So after you might have discussed some materials and there might have been a lot of statements going out you might settle down the class and give an explanation of, what was discussed, and clarifying some questions or some information that might have been said but not really fully flushed out. And the next one is providing points of view before discussion. This might help with some students to get a better understanding of what is being discussed in like an argument or or a debate, and so that they might take a side thinking, oh hey, I actually do believe, and I do kind of side with one side of this, so they might show more interest when going over that material. And then the final one is explaining and going over difficult material. This is pretty basic. If you are getting the idea that the class overall is just having a difficult time understanding a certain material, you might make sure that you spend a little bit more time on the material in order for everyone to fully understand it. This part of the chapter really emphasizes that lecturing is something that is used quite a bit in teaching, but one thing that is really important is that you make sure that you keep the students interested and make sure that it isn't dull or boring in order to make it more effective of a teaching strategy. Right, the next slide is kind of short. It's titled Questioning and Discussing. It says integrating questions into teacher-centered instruction can help to understand student learning needs and to keep the class's attention. It's basically dips a little bit into the stuff talked about during the lecturing, explaining, and demonstration part of this presentation. It's just a reminder that you need to make sure that you keep track of if your students are really understanding it, and that getting them involved in a discussion, or creating a discussion in the class can really help kids to stay more attentive in class, and therefore take in more of the material rather than just dozing off in the back of class. So the next slide is mastery learning. There are a set of procedures that can help to meet mastery learning. The first one is to specify the lesson or learning task, which is basically just explaining what you are going to be teaching your classroom that day. The second one is to break down the course into units that align with objectives. So if you have a set of objectives that you want to teach them over a time period, making sure that you have units of the class that are going over material that will meet each objective. The third is planning instructional procedures. This is basically just having an idea of what you will do if you need to provide some corrective feedback to students. If they aren't fully getting the material, making sure that you have some way to further assist them so that they don't get behind. And the final one is an end of unit or course test. This is basically just to gauge them to make sure that they have met a mastery level of learning, and to make sure that they actually learned from class. So the next slide is titled Seat Work and Homework. It is the last two of the strategies given by Santrock for learner-centered lesson planning. The first one is seat work. This is basically meant to allow teachers to keep track of a student's progress and make sure that they are staying on task and just being there so that you can give them correct guidance in doing their work. The next one is homework. It really discusses more of the issues with homework in the text, how it's important to really find a point where it's not too much homework, because using too much homework, it states that it can cause friction between parents and the school. The next slide is learner-centered lesson planning. It just introduces a set of guidelines developed by work group of the American Psychological Association Board of Educational Affairs in the 1990s. This was basically a framework of 14 guidelines that is meant to help implement learner-centered instruction in the classroom. On the next slide, there is a graphic that shows the 14 guidelines. You can pause this for now if you want to look over that. Okay, the next slide after the graphic that discusses the learner-centered lesson planning guidelines is entitled Learner-Centered Instructional Strategies. It basically just gives a few short strategies to implement when using a learner-centered instruction. The first one is a problem-based learning, just giving the students a problem to solve, gives more of a real-world idea on the topic that you were discussing. The second is essential questions, basically just having a set idea of material that they should know and questions that they should be able to answer. And the third is discovery learning, where instead of you giving them the material, you might indirectly guide them in finding the material themselves. So you might give them a handout that discusses the material, and then they have to go through and read a few pages and find the answers themselves. Okay, the next slide is question 3 from the form that was sent to you guys. Question is, do you prefer teacher or learner-centered instruction, and why? Just a quick explanation of which one you think you would prefer to use as a teacher. So the next slide is titled Technology. It's just an introduction slide. It's kind of short. It's just introducing the next portion of the presentation on technology. It states, technology can be a great tool to implement in the classroom. However, it is important to implement it correctly in order to use its full potential. In the textbook, Santrok discusses shortly how it is important that when implementing technology, that you do it in a way that will help the students and a way that really guides them to use it properly and to actually get something out of learning. The next slide is titled Uses of Technology. Two of the main uses of technology that are talked about in the textbook are the internet and presentations. For the internet, it just discusses how the use of it can help students to perform more thorough research on material for presentations or projects. It can give them a further idea of the material outside of what is given to them in the textbook or in class. The next one is software, like PowerPoint. PowerPoint can be a great tool for both students and teachers. It can help make teacher presentations a little bit more better, more entertaining. For the projects, it can help a student make a better presentation. It really helps with spreading out the information and kind of grouping it up so it's better understood by the students. So the next slide is also titled Technology. The use of technology in the classroom can help to develop skills for students to become better learners in the future. One of the ways that it can help is through the active use of technology to learn outside of the classroom. It's pretty silly, but I guess they might be referencing hey, Google it. You just are like, oh, hey, I wonder what happened here, or what happened, why this is the way it is. And Google can give them an answer, and the internet can give them an answer to that and further develop their knowledge. The next one is students can develop skills that will help them in the future in jobs. A lot of technology is used, and so getting understanding of technology while still in school will really help so that when they go into the workforce, they know how a computer works basically. The next one is technology can provide a wider variety of problem-solving material, allowing the student to become more creative. So they have a lot of access to stuff that you might not be able to do just in a classroom. You might be able to research stuff in a different way, or think of another way of studying with access to technology, which would really help them in the sense of learning. And the final one on this slide is technology can be used to give students a greater understanding of cultural differences around the world. This basically is just when you can look up what the ideologies of different people are, you can get a better idea of how people around the world are different from you in their ideas and based off of their culture. And just technology helps give a better understanding of that through the use of the internet and stuff like that. So that brings us to our final slide, is the fourth and final question of the form that was sent out. The question is there any other ways that you can think of to implement technology in a classroom? Is there some app that you can think of that you've found that is really cool, or is there some game that would help students learn better? Yeah. So that is the end of the presentation. My name is Tyler Dowling. I am the one narrating, and my partner Jesse F. Did a lot of the presentation layout, and that is all. Thank you for listening.